WikiLeaks is raising a €100,000 reward for Europe's most wanted secret, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership.
This is something enormous. It is about a final control, and it's the United States saying there may be another power in the world, but we will be the ultimate power.
The TTIP is the most important thing that is happening in Europe right now. It's a secretive deal being negotiated between Europe and the United States.
Once signed, it will cement a key part of the US government's plan to create a new global bloc that will ensure the dominance of its largest companies. And to understand why, we need to go back to the 1950s.
See the USA in your Chevrolet. America's asking you to call. Drive your Chevrolet through the USA.
After the Second World War, the United States accounted for half of the world's economy. Its influence was unmatched by any country, and it was able to write the early rules of international trade to its advantage. The World Trade Organization was created in this context, and the US dictated rules that favored American business. But as economies like China and India joined the WTO, it became a more democratized arena, and the US found it harder to control its decision-making.
At the WTO, at its Doha rounds, India spoke up and Brazil spoke up, and the US lost control.
I think it's no use beating around the bush. This meeting has collapsed.
The US felt it needed a new strategy to maintain its global dominance. So in the classical American style, they went big. To bypass the WTO, they're creating the biggest international agreements that the world has ever seen. They're called the three big T's: the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, and the Trade in Services Agreement, or TISA. And they're all being negotiated in secret right now.
We only found out when WikiLeaks was able to leak parts of them.
And what's interesting is when you look across all of these deals, whether it be TTIP, TPP or TISA, China is excluded, but also Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, they're all excluded because those are the emerging economies.
What is not often understood is that these agreements are part of a geopolitical war. This is a new war which is taking place between the United States and China. The United States is very scared of the rise of China, so it has moved to militarily encircle it through what is called the pivot to Asia, and now it's moving on to doing that economically.
The basic idea which comes across from reading US strategy papers is the construction of a new grand enclosure. And to put inside this grand enclosure the United States, 51 other countries, 1.6 billion people, and 2/3 of global GDP. To integrate Latin America away from Brazil and towards the United States, to integrate Southeast Asia away from China and towards the United States, and to integrate Western Europe, pulling it away from Eurasia as a whole and towards the Atlantic.
Of the three big T's, WikiLeaks has revealed 4 chapters of the TPP, which affects 12 countries in the Americas and Southeast Asia. We also obtained and released the core text of TISA, which affects 52 countries, including the EU. But nearly all of TTIP is still secret. When signed, TTIP will cover half of global GDP and will affect every European member state. Yet EU parliamentarians have serious restrictions in accessing the proposed agreement.
Yeah, I find it incredible as well that for something which is a trade agreement, not a matter of life and death in terms of security, where maybe you can understand some restrictions, and we don't even like those very much, but for a trade agreement, you know, that we can't actually make notes about what it is we're reading, issues that we might want to take away to look into, which actually might reassure us, you know, if we really were able to sort of take this away and look at it in depth.
We don't have access to the key documents, the most important ones, because the devil is in the detail. When it comes to trade agreements, you need to know exactly what's in the text so that you can assess what the impact's going to be.
If EU parliamentarians want to see the TTIP, they have to call the US embassy and make an appointment. The appointments are only available 2 days a week for 2-hour time slots. Only 2 parliamentarians are permitted at once. They go to the US embassy, they have to hand in every electronic device, so they cannot possibly make a copy. They must agree to keep everything confidential, and then they're led to a secure reading room where 2 US embassy guards watch everything that they do. How can EU parliamentarians possibly understand what they're negotiating for Europe under these circumstances?
The world's biggest corporations don't have the same problem. They have been receiving VIP access from day one and have had abundant influence in the negotiations.
People, the likes of you and I, are excluded. Governments, to a great extent, are excluded. Those who are included are the multinational corporations.
These agreements are basically corporate ownership agreements. The funny thing about free trade agreements, as we understand them, is they often have nothing to do with trade in the sense of the mutual lowering of tariffs. What they're about is enshrining an investor rights regime in the respective countries and ensuring that corporations can run wild in the respective economies with very, very little regulation or impingement by government or authorities.
These treaties will have huge, huge implications for literally almost every critical issue that an individual citizen or community would care about: health, education, the environment, privacy, access to medicines. I mean, the list could go on.
One of the most criticised aspects of TTIP is a system called the Investor State Dispute Settlement, or ISDS. It's a secretive international tribunal that allows companies to sue states over virtually anything that they can claim affects their investment.
If a protest affects their profits, they can sue. If laws affect their profits, they can sue. If new regulations might impact where or what they want to do with their money, they can sue.
This is a new power which will be handed over to US corporations to sue the governments of Europe in a parallel judicial system which is available to them alone. So people have no access to it, domestic firms have no access to it, governments have no access to it. It's just there for foreign investors, in this case, US corporations.
Based on ISDS history, critics argue that European state sovereignty and democracy are at serious risk. Previous lawsuits include Swedish company Vattenfall suing the German state for $3.7 billion for phasing out nuclear energy. British American Tobacco sued Australia for passing a law limiting cigarette advertising. The French company Veolia sued Egypt for raising the minimum wage. TTIP advocates say that in order for the EU and US to become a single market, regulatory barriers need to be eliminated. This way, for example, a US seatbelt manufacturer already selling seatbelts domestically wouldn't need to test for safety a second time, as the EU would agree to recognise the US safety standards. They argue that this would save costs, create jobs, and lower prices for consumers. But just how safe are US standards?
So in the USA, 70% of all processed food sold in supermarkets contains genetically modified ingredients, whereas in the European Union, we've said quite clearly we don't want GM ingredients in our food chain. Similarly, in the US, 90% of all beef is produced using growth hormones, which have been found to be carcinogenic in humans. So they're banned in the European Union. And what the US government is saying is that under TTIP, under the free trade rules that they want to bring in, European consumers don't get the right to choose.
TTIP includes all the most important public sectors in Europe, including education, water, railways, postal services, and most controversially, it also includes public health services.
What is so scary about this is that corporations want to lock in their power. So they not only want increased power, but they want to make it impossible for sovereign governments to reverse the changes which are going to give them power. So, for example, with TTIP, if it passes with ISDS in it, the privatisation of the National Health Service, which is happening in the UK, can never be reversed.
What is democratic about an enormous imposition of power on countries whose citizens have no way of knowing what's going on, of debating it, or influencing their government in its decision. That's anti-democratic.
The history of these agreements shows that they're very difficult to change unless people can see what's in them. And that's why they're kept secret. Because when the contents are revealed, it generates an opposition.
WikiLeaks has had considerable success delaying the TPP and opening up the debate around it and the TISA by releasing the secret draft texts. Our publication of an earlier proposed US-EU agreement, the ACTA, killed it in.
Now you talk about terror. I've been terrorized all my day. Hammer all my day.
Hi, I'm Chris Hedges. Welcome to Days of Revolt. Today we're going to be discussing trade agreements such as the TPP, which Ralph Nader calls the most brazen corporate power grab in American history. We'll be talking with attorney Kevin Zies, former Green Party candidate in Maryland for the Senate and one of the leaders of Popular Resistance. Welcome, Kevin.
Thanks for having me on.
So let's begin with this quote from Ralph, who I think you were Ralph's spokesperson in 2004, was it?
In his most popular year after 2000.
Right, there you go.
It was a pleasure to work with Ralph that year.
Well, I think we're both huge admirers of Ralph Nader. And so this is Ralph's response when I called him up after the TPP was, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership was made public. The TPP, along with the World Trade Organization and the North American Free Trade Agreement, is the most brazen corporate power grab in American history. It allows corporations to bypass our three branches of government, to impose enforceable sanctions by secret tribunals. These tribunals can declare our labor, consumer, and environmental protections to be unlawful, non-tariff barriers subject to fines for non-compliance. The TPP establishes a transnational, autocratic system of enforceable governance in defiance of our domestic laws. And let's begin by talking or clarifying that this is part of a triad of agreements.
That's right.
And then maybe you can respond to Ralph's.
Sure. Yeah, President Obama has been pursuing in secret negotiations three major trade deals that will create a complete global network of laws that favor corporations. These laws have been written of, by, and for the corporations. We've gotten to see one of them, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and it's not as bad as we thought. It's worse.
Right.
And that's the TPP. That covers the Asian countries. About 12 countries are involved in that.
And it's 40%
of the GDP.
Right.
And then they have another agreement, the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which was with Europe. And then the third one, which is the biggest one that's got the least attention and maybe have the most impact, is TISA, the Trade and Investment Services Agreement. And that covers services, which is 80% of the U.S. economy.
Now we're talking about postal
services, educational services, health services, accounting, legal services, 80% of the U.S. economy. And so that's a massive deal. So these are three deals. TISA has 50 countries involved. What's not in any of these deals, by the way, is the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The BRICS countries are kept out. Pretty interesting. I think that's because what we're looking at here is really a next stage of the global capitalist empire dominated by the United States and Western corporations. That's what this is part of. And so I think it's important to put in that concept. It's not a coincidence that while we're negotiating TPP, we're also doing, Obama is also doing a Asian pivot surrounding China with military. It's not consistent that we're doing TTIP with Europe at the same time that Obama is ringing Russia with NATO military troops, because this is part of a global empire that the U.S. runs pretty much on behalf of global transnational corporations.
And now it should be clear in the second set of agreements that you mentioned, we haven't seen those yet.
We haven't seen it. The only reason we're seeing TPP is because we had an intense fight in Congress over the issue of fast track. Fast track is trade authority for Obama, where he can sign the agreement before Congress considers it, limits Congress's power greatly to an up or down vote.
This was something, you know, created or dreamt up by the Nixon.
Nixon was the first president to have fast
and essentially
track.
it eradicates the possibility of public debate.
Exactly. Congress holds no hearings, there's no testimony, no witnesses.
And they're not allowed to make any amendments, no changes, nothing.
Up or down vote, that's it. And in the Senate, there's no filibuster, so it's only 50%. You can't force them to 60 votes. It's only 51 they need. And so it's a very restricted Congress. And all these agreements, by the way, as Ralph mentions in that quote, greatly restrict each branch of government, and Congress is really...
Well, let's talk a little bit about how they do that, this kind of, you know, part of this kind of creeping coup d'etat. Corporate coup d'etat that's taken.
And I just want to say one more thing about this coup d'etat. This is just one aspect of it. You know, we're seeing the corporate power grow in the United States with Citizens United and the buying of elections and all that corruption. But we're also out of places like the World Economic Forum. They've come out with a working group called that's redesigning the Global Redesign Initiative. That's redesigning the way governance works to minimize the nation state and maximize transnational corporate. They want the UN to become a hybrid government and corporate body. So that's what the World Economic Forum is working on as this is all going on too. So this is a big, big fight about where we go. This is the epic struggle of our times. Corporate power versus people power. Now the way that what Ralph was talking about in that quote was one aspect of this, which is the trade tribunal system, which already exists, but this is expanded. For the first time, for example, financial services can use the trade tribunals to overrule legislation to regulate the big banks.
Now these trade tribunals, they're three-person tribunals. They're made up of corporate, you know, lawyers. One of the things I think I was speaking with you that you told me is that if you're a citizen or advocacy group, you're excluded from even going to these.
Yeah, you know, in our federal court system, which is the third branch of government that Ralph's favorite branch, I think. He just opened a museum.
Right, a tort museum.
In his hometown, a wonky tort museum, which is a great museum. People should go to Winstead to see it, by the way. But anyway, in our federal court system, an individual can sue a corporation. They can find a lawyer who takes it on retainer. They don't only get paid if they win. You get a jury of your peers to decide it. It's a whole, that's a real court system.
Right.
It has lots of weaknesses that need to be improved on. They've been cutting back on it as much as they could with so-called tort reform, as Ralph calls tort deform. So it's getting weaker, but it's still an important branch of government. This overrules that. Our courts cannot review what a trade tribunal does. The trade tribunal judges are three corporate lawyers who can also represent corporations in other cases. So there's a real conflict of interest there, because if you're a lawyer who's filing suits on behalf of corporations, these trade tribunals, you want to broaden the power of the trade tribunal and the corporation. So as a judge, you can decide things that say corporations have this power, corporations have that power. No, that the security issue doesn't matter. The corporation still wins. They can create legal fictions.
So give me some examples of how this trumps domestic law, how it would potentially.
Well, in fact, what's really interesting about it is we saw it during the fast track debate, when President Obama was saying this does not affect legislation. During the fast track debate, the World Trade Organization was ruling on a case from Mexico and Canada against the United States on labeling of meats and country of origin labeling. So we knew where our meat came from at every stage of the process. And the World Trade Organization says, you're going to lose that, you got to repeal that law or you're going to face fines. During the fast track debate, they repealed COOL. And Obama signed it while he's saying it doesn't affect legislation.
Right.
You know, happening at the same time. It's just like mind-boggling that they could say one thing and be doing the exact opposite. So that means that the Trade Tribunal decided U.S. law, a very popular U.S. law. People want to know where their food comes from. And that law was repealed during the fast track debate.
Okay, let's talk about how this is going to affect workers, wages, unions, all of those mechanisms by which we are protected from the abuses of corporate power.
Well, one thing that's very lucky about the fast track fight we had, we actually get to see the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They actually planned to keep it secret for 4 years after it passed.
After it was implemented.
4 years.
A 5,400 and
almost 6,000 page document of intricate changes of all aspects of our law, really. Because we fought so hard in fast track, they had to compromise and agree to release it for 90 days before Congress considered it. So we're in that process now of reviewing it, and people are starting to see what's in it. So I can answer your question actually based on what's in the document, and also based on reactions by economists and others. You asked about wages and labor. Well, the research shows that 90% of Americans will have their wages go down. Only the top % will see an increase in wages.
And explain why.
Because we're in a race to the bottom. One of the provisions of the TPP that we didn't really know about until we saw the published document was an immigration provision, unlimited immigration for businesses. In other words, we have phone companies that are certain, we can't, let's say only 5 phone companies are allowed. Mexico can come in with a phone company and compete. There's no restriction. And they can bring their employees with them and pay them Mexican wages. How does a U.S. phone company compete with that?
Right.
And that's just not for phone companies. That's just one example. So, and if the United States doesn't allow companies to come in like that, they can take them to the trade tribunal and force them to.
Right.
We're losing control of our sovereignty. We're losing control of our economy. We're losing control of our democracy. On the environmental
let's go back to wages, because you had made a point in this interview that I did with you, you know, wages in Vietnam are what, 35, 65 cents an hour, and that in essence, this trade agreement forces the American workforce to become quote unquote competitive in a global market.
Yeah, and how is that possible? How can American workers, when 51% of Americans right now are earning under $30,000 a year, near the poverty level, near the government's poverty, which is already, you know, in reality, poverty is much higher than that. But even with that artificial poverty, most workers are earning that now. How can we compete with 60 cents an hour in Vietnam, with 90 cents in
Which is
Peru?
essentially what these agreements are forcing us to do.
What they're doing is they're giving corporate power the ability to force down wages, to go where the wages are lowest, to go where they can get the cheapest resources, to where the most lax laws on taking resources out of the ground. You know, on all these issues, it is a race to the bottom. And so people have to rise up now.
Right.
Because this race to the bottom will affect every aspect. Our foods will be less safe.
Right.
You know, the provisions now allow for a corporation, when food's being inspected at the border, a corporation can stop the inspection if it's going to take too long, if we have to send it in for testing to see what kind of poisons are in it. The corporations can sue to stop that.
So the ISDS, they can sue if there's any interference by government for projected profits.
Exactly. And that's another thing about this. In addition to having these corporate lawyers who also serve as corporate lawyers, corporate lawyer judges and corporate lawyers, deciding, they can decide the penalty. And the expected profits is one of the penalties that can
So give me an example of how that might work.
A fracking company decides to frack in an area. The government then decides that fracking is illegal, it's too risky for the environment in that area, it's too close to the underground water supply, and they ban it. Or they even regulate it.
Right.
A fracking company a foreign fracking company, because domestic companies don't have this power, just the foreign companies can sue. So actually our domestic companies are put at a disadvantage.
Right.
The foreign company can sue not just for what they invested in starting the process of figuring out fracking and testing wells and stuff, but also for their expected profits, what they thought they were going to make before the government acted in the public interest. So it just eviscerates the potential of public interest. I mean, in the United States, we'll have problems with that too, but can you imagine a poorer country like Vietnam where there's desperation? Are they going to pass a law that raises wages? Are they going to pass a law that protects the environment? Are they going to pass a law that requires worker safety or consumer standards when they know they can be sued by Goldman Sachs or by Monsanto?
Well, and we also know that those laws, even when they're passed, are almost never enforced. I mean, we see that in places like Vietnam or China.
That's right. You have lots of unions in China, but they're unions that are friendly. The government unions.
Run.
And that's what Obama's talking about, how great it is that Vietnam's going to have unions. Well, yeah, they'll be unions in name only. They will be unions that
Well, Obama has said that the TPP reverses the more egregious acts by previous trade agreements like NAFTA.
It's the exact opposite. In 2007, because of public pressure, the Bush administration agreed to a number of environmental standards, for example. That doesn't exist any longer. Labor standards, weakened. There's no enforcement of labor or environmental standards. And the environmental standards are written in such a way that they're unenforceable.
Well, and we should also throw in that you can have the climate change conference in Paris.
Exactly.
They can pass
Exactly.
non-binding agreements,
Exactly.
and essentially these trade agreements obliterate them.
Exactly. If this trade agreement, for example, puts any block on extreme energy extraction, and the Paris conference says you have to stop, extracting tar sands and fracked gas because of the climate effects, guess who wins? The TPP wins, the TTIP wins, TISA wins. The trade agreements that become law, and they become essentially treaty-like law, which surpasses every other law.
So I'm going to talk about TISA, but first let's talk about pharmaceuticals, because that's a big issue.
That's a very interesting issue. It's interesting on two ways. One, we think pharmaceuticals got a great deal here. They're going to be rising prices.
Explain why.
There'll be U.S. rising prices exported to the world because we've created this system of patents that gives great protection to monopoly.
And we've also thwarted the possibility of generic drugs.
And part of that, the one way you can enforce the patent is you don't allow the generic drugs to use the research done for the pharmaceutical drug when they get a generic for a certain number of years. And so that makes it almost impossible for a generic to come on the market. They can't afford to do the research. They're blocked from getting on the market for many years. But it's interesting, the pharmaceutical companies actually oppose this agreement because they didn't get enough on biologic drugs.
Yeah, right.
You know how capitalism is.
Right, right.
It's never enough, right?
Right.
We want more. I know we're gluttonously fat, but we need more.
Right, right.
And so they're actually fighting this. And one of the interesting things is the corporate divide on this. Pharmaceuticals want a better deal. Orrin Hatch, who's the most important, other than Mitch McConnell, most important member of the Senate. He's the chair of the Senate Finance Committee. Who's very into the pharmaceutical pockets. He is saying this is a bad deal. We should probably wait till 2017 before we consider it. We can get a better deal with a new administration. And the tobacco companies are angry as well because they've been cut out of the ISDS process to some degree. And so Mitch McConnell is a big tobacco guy, so he's not too happy with it. So there's some
but even if
the
TPP goes through, I had read the price of pharmaceuticals are going to rise.
No question. I think the pharmaceuticals got a great deal.
And why will they rise?
They will rise because it's an enforced monopoly. It's an enforced monopoly through patent.
Was it for 8 years or something?
And then it can be renewed if they change the formula, or they, if it's now it's not just for headaches, but for stomach aches. If they go from a pill to a drink, so there's all sorts of ways they can extend the patent.
Let's talk about unions. What's this going to do to labor unions? Legitimate labor unions, not government run.
Well, it's going to mean that if a country puts in place a law that allows for collective bargaining, for unions to be formed, it'll allow that to go to a trade tribunal to be challenged. And there are there's some talk about labor standards, but there's no enforcement. The only way you can have enforcement of these tribunals is if people are given the right to go to court.
And they don't have that.
And they don't have.
If you're not a corporation, you can't use
these courts are unlike the federal courts. These courts are only for one party. Corporations, well, and government too. So corporations and government are the only ones that use these tribunals. If you have a community that's polluted by a foreign corporation, no lawsuit.
Right.
If you have a union that's destroyed, no lawsuit. If you have consumers who are injured by poison products, no lawsuits. People have no way to sue. And if the trade tribunal reaches an opinion that's absurd, our federal courts can't review it. There's no appellate process.
Okay, let's talk about TISA because it's extremely important, as you have pointed out. It has the capacity to destroy
the Postal Service.
The Postal Service,
public
education, and explain that process, how TISA, the mechanisms within TISA will do that.
The Trade in Services Agreement, TISA, is focused on its basic thrust is privatization and commodification of public services. That's its basic thrust, as well as some private services like accounting and others. But all three of these agreements really have a distaste for state-supported or state-owned enterprises. Something like the Postal Service is a state-owned enterprise.
Right.
And it's a one-way street with TISA. It's move toward privatization, move only in that direction. Once something's privatized, it cannot be made public again. And so that's the exact process.
But they've built into TISA ways that virtually undercut the possibility of public services to maintain themselves.
They insist that any public service, a state-owned enterprise, all the special privileges a state-owned enterprise gets as far as taxes and investment and such, need to also go to the private
I mean, they call it leveling the playing field.
Leveling the playing field, except when it comes to monopolies. Then we unlevel the playing field in favor of the monopolists. But when it comes to things like public services, and that's just, I think, that's why I say this is the epic battle of our times, because this is really about corporate power versus people power. It's about democracy versus a corporate
What's left
rule.
of democracy?
What's left of democracy? We have a very managed democracy in this country. That's you know, it's hard to call. I call it a mirage democracy, with managed elections, because that's what we've really come.
Well, and we have figures like Hillary Clinton, who has been, you know, utterly obsequious to corporate power throughout his entire career.
You can make a long list of the obsequious to corporate
power. Sure, but I mean, she's out there opposing the TPP.
Former Walmart board member,
right?
Who's now opposed to TPP because it's so unpopular.
Right,
but when she's in office, we don't expect much.
No, well, we got that with Obama. So you have been through popular.
Let's turn now to another big story most of us know even less about than drones. TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's a trade agreement the United States is negotiating with Australia, Canada, Japan, and 8 other countries in the Pacific region. If you don't know about the TPP, and few do, it's because the powerful people behind it, including President Obama, don't want you to know. The negotiations are shrouded in secrecy, and once they're completed, Obama wants to rush the agreement through Congress, fast tracking, they call it, with our elected representatives given the choice only of voting it up or down. Last year, over 130 members of Congress asked the White House for more transparency about what's being negotiated, and were essentially told to go fly a kite. You can be sure of this, however. A select group of corporate partners, companies like General Electric, Goldman Sachs, and Pfizer, the pharmaceutical giant, are not likely to be in the dark. Players like these stand to be the real beneficiaries of the agreement because, like other so-called free trade agreements, TPP actually will reward those at the top, even as it creates rules that will override domestic laws on the environment, workplace safety, and investment. Corporate lobbyists already are lining up in Washington to ram the agreement through once the White House hurries it out of the delivery room. How do we know this? Because some vigilant, independent watchdogs are tracking the negotiations with sources they trust, and 2 are with me now. Eve Smith is an expert on investment banking and the founder of Aurora Advisors, a New York-based management consulting firm. She runs the Naked Capitalism blog, a go-to site for information and insight on the business and ethics of finance. Dean Baker is co-director of the Progressive Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. He's been a senior economist at the Economic Policy Institute and a consultant to Congress and the World Bank. I rarely miss his blog, Beat the Press, and I'm a regular reader of his column in the Guardian newspaper. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having me here.
12 nations are involved in negotiating this treaty, and so far, hardly a peep or leak from inside. Why so much secrecy?
Well, it's a very strange procedure here. Essentially what you've done is you've parceled out chunks of the agreement. So you have an agreement, a portion of it dealing with prescription drugs, you have a portion dealing with the internet, you have portions of it dealing with various aspects of environmental regulations, and you only have those parties to the table that are directly involved. When I'm saying directly involved, essentially the industry groups. So it's not as though we brought the environmentalists there to talk about what sort of environmental regulation we want around fracking. You have the industry groups, the oil and gas industry. They're sitting down there with their counterparts in the other countries deciding what sort of regulations you'll have on fracking. So it's a very peculiar way to go about doing a treaty, and I think if there were more public knowledge of it, people would be very unhappy.
It's very peculiar to have this, an agreement of this importance be kept so much under wraps. One of the things that is known is apparently only 5 of the 29 chapters actually have anything to do with trade. So really it's a mistake to call it a trade agreement. This is really an agreement that's purpose is substantially to weaken nation-based regulation while at the same time strengthening intellectual property protections. So it's basically a gimme to companies on both ends.
Well, if there is so much secrecy, how do we know what we don't know, to paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld?
I mean, there have been some leaks from people involved in the process, so there have been bits and pieces that have come out. But it's very difficult to really know what is in there. They give limited access to members of Congress, and this again, he was just making a comment about that. This really, to my mind, is quite a scandal. So even a member of Congress, our elected representatives, can't just go in there and say, let me see where this stands, where the latest text is. They can get limited access to parts of it. They can't bring their staff in, and they're basically sworn to secrecy.
Some people have seen pieces. One of the groups that's been very on top of this has been a Washington, D.C. group called Public Citizen. And from the pieces they've been able to put together, they see that it, for example, will allow drug companies to increase prices, to extend the term of their patent, so the patent protection will go longer. It'll be much longer before anything will become generic. It would restrict buying local of all sorts. So, for example, governments would not be able to, say we're only going to be able to buy from people in state or people in the U.S. It would make things like GMO labeling impermissible. It would weaken environmental regulations. For example, you couldn't say, gee, Chinese tilapia, we don't want to import that anymore because it's become too toxic. That kind of restriction would not be permissible.
Yeah, let me carry that even a step further with the prescription drugs, just to try and put some dollars and cents on that. We spend around $300 billion a year on prescription drugs. Without patent and other similar protection, we'd be spending about $30 billion. So this is, how much we're paying extra for prescription drugs because we have patent-related protections. Now, you could imagine a trade agreement. If this were really about trade, we'd be going, how can we bring those prices down? But instead, what you have is the drug companies there, and they're not talking about how to bring them down. They're talking about how to bring them up, primarily in other countries, but they'd like to bring them up in the United States as well.
Is that free trade?
It's the opposite.
Patent laws, free trade?
It's a protection, and that's what I just find so amazing. It's called patent protection, and then they're going, that's free trade, and go, no, this is a government-granted monopoly, and that just speaks to, how convoluted our language has become, that it's not free trade if we don't extend a government-granted monopoly long into the future.
Doesn't the entertainment industry also stand to gain?
Yes, one of the things that there's a European counterpart of the Trans-Pacific Partnership that's also in a negotiation. And one of the things that France is upset about is that they provide subsidies to their entertainment industry. The idea that a French film that would only appear in an art house cinema is any threat to the American movie industry, that's absurd, and yet that kind of thing would not be permissible under that version of the deal. What happens, one of the things that would happen apparently under both deals is even more severe restrictions on copying and transfers, to the point where one of the an internet group called the Electronic Frontier Foundation said it would even interfere with the basic operation of the internet because things like temporary copies wouldn't be permitted under this rule.
Also, there's an issue of enforcement here that people might remember the Stop Online Piracy Act that they were trying to get through in the United States a couple years ago. And of course, there was a big uprising against a lot of grassroots opposition. A lot of companies, in fact, came out in opposition to it. And one of the big points there was that it required third parties. So if someone posted something on my website that turned out to violate a copyright of Warner Brothers, well, under that, I could be held liable for this. Warner Brothers could take action, legal action against me. As it stands now, if I have material that violates their copyright, it's incumbent on Warner Brothers to go, oh, you have to take this down, and then I have, a reasonable time period to take it down.
So is this why you wrote the other day, this could make Google, Facebook, and indeed anyone with a website into a copyright cop?
Exactly.
But this is the paradox to me. As you've just said, stronger copyright and patent protection is the very opposite of free trade. They involve government intervention in the market. They restrict competition. They lead, as you've just said, to higher prices for consumers. How can you describe this as a free trade agreement?
I think the free trade idea is what's being used to bully a lot of the countries into it, that if you're not part of this deal, you'll somehow be left on the outside. For example, there's a big argument apparently in Japan about this right now, that Japan is one of the late joiners to the negotiations. And some groups in Japan have started objecting, and the government's saying, well, if we don't participate, everybody else will be in and we'll be out. So that's the leverage that America's apparently using to try to get people on board.
But it's really important to point out it isn't free trade. If you look at the actual trade barriers that exist between the United States and these other countries, at this point they're almost all very small. If you have a tariff of 1 or 2%, things like that, it really doesn't matter whether it's there or it's zero. So what this is really about is, these sorts of, in many cases, provisions increasing barriers or restricting the ability to have environmental regulations, health and safety regulations. That's what's really about. Trade's really peripheral.
That's how this works in combination with the secrecy provision. It's free trade because nobody knows otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
What is your greatest concern about this?
I think the drugs one is my biggest one. The second one, frankly, is financial services, because this would also basically make a lot of financial services regulation that we now have pretty much impossible. It would force everything. Well, apparently financial services is one of the chapters, and so again, it would lead to a race to the bottom, that any country, that any signatory to the pact could say, gee, XYZ country has weaker regulations, you're hurting us by making us adhere to this higher standard. And in particular, and another sort of interesting conflict, is that one of the things that it rules out is capital controls. Now, historically, people used to say that, again, there was sort of simple-minded idea that capital controls weren't such a good thing. And now the IMF has come around and has said that capital controls, certain types, are actually desirable. Chile and Malaysia had them both going into the crisis, and they did better than a lot of other countries as a result of having them. But that, in fact, may be one of the things that makes this deal founder, that some of the countries that have them and like them are objecting to the fact that these are included in the pact.
Is it conceivable to you that this could affect the enforcement of Dodd-Frank, which was ostensibly passed to prevent another great crash like 2008? Could this affect the enforcement of Dodd-Frank?
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly the derivatives regulation, and I would expect the capital levels. There's no
How would that work?
The first language in both these deals goes something along the lines with all signatories are required to make their laws and regulations conform to the standards of this agreement. They are literally required to make their nation-based laws subordinate to the terms of these agreements. And again, we don't know exactly what's in them, but the whole notion is that they are to permit very liberalized capital flows and minimal restrictions. So Dodd-Frank basically is consistent with that.
So foreign trade partners would conceivably be allowed to challenge American laws?
Yeah.
That's exactly
the point. I mean, one of the things it extends is a concept that exists in NAFTA, but which is that you have special panels that companies can go to get matters adjudicated if they believe that regulations have led them to lose profit. And it's not even necessarily that they've currently lost profit, it's that they have potentially lost profit. For example, one case that's now pending under NAFTA is that Quebec has an anti-fracking prohibition to protect the St. Lawrence River Valley. There's a U.S. company that's suing $250 million, and if they win that case before the special panel, the Quebec government will have to pay that amount. Under the TPP, you'll see an enormous expansion of that kind of power.
Both of you are good at arguing the other side for the purposes of debate. So what's good about this? I mean, why should anybody be for this free trade agreement that's not a free trade agreement?
Yeah, it is really hard for me to see. I mean, I'm sure if we had the whole text in front of us, I'm sure both of us would be able to find things we go, that good, that good. I mean, there has to be something that's good, but the way it's being constructed, it's not the way in which you design a treaty that's intended to benefit the bulk of the population of either the United States or the other countries. I mean, you wouldn't just have the corporate interest there, and that's literally what you've done. I mean, it is kind of amazing. What are they going to do? They're going to try to ensure that it maximizes their profits. Now, not everything they have there is going to be bad, but I suspect most of the clauses in there are going to be to advance their interest.
One of the aspects of the Trans-Pacific Partnership is it's an everyone but China deal. One of the intentions of the deal is to isolate China. So if you think isolating China is a good thing, then that would be a reason to support the deal. Now, in fact, ironically, a lot of the companies that are supporting this deal may not have thought through all the implications, because a lot of them have extended supply chains that go through China. If this disrupts their current supply chains, they might actually have to reorganize their lives a bit more than they had thought.
Our economies are very integrated. Yeah. One would expect that they'll continue to be integrated. So the idea that we're going to isolate them, I don't really see how that would work in any case. But if that were a goal of policy, if we actually could get to a situation where we did sort of separate the countries, that would not be a pretty picture. So I think we have to look to integrate with them, and ideally on better terms than we currently have.
Some people refer to this Pacific deal as the, quote, North American Free Trade Agreement on steroids. Does that make sense to you?
Well, it does, because the North American Trade Agreement, in the end, wound up helping corporations and didn't do much for American workers. In fact, there have been economists who said that NAFTA produced as much as nearly 1 million job losses in the U.S. And the whole notion of this agreement is to facilitate the movement of capital and to give capital even more privileges than it has now. So, workers, except for a few who have a seat at the table like the UAW, workers are basically in the back of the bus on this one.
President Clinton promised a lot with NAFTA. Listen to this.
NAFTA will tear down trade barriers between our three nations. It will create the world's largest trade zone and create 200,000 jobs in this country by 1995 alone. The environmental and labor side agreements negotiated by our administration will make this agreement a force for social progress as well as economic growth.
Did NAFTA bring us hundreds of thousands of jobs? Did we get better environmental and labor standards? What did we get?
You'd be very hard-pressed to see us having gotten jobs from NAFTA. I mean, you had a number of companies you could identify that shift operations to Mexico, and that was clearly a main point of the agreement because there's extensive chapters on investment, and much of the agreement was about making it easy for, say, a General Electric, General Motors to shift their operations to Mexico and know that they would be guaranteed that there wouldn't be an issue of expropriation, they wouldn't have to worry about repatriating their profits. That was really a point of the agreement. So we did lose a lot of jobs to Mexico for that reason. In terms of the environmental and labor standards, those were thrown in as an afterthought. Now, you've had some effort to take advantage of those. I wouldn't really say it's had much impact. I mean, basically to help the situation of some unions in Mexico or workers trying to organize unions in Mexico. But those really were an afterthought, and they weren't intended. It's the way it's always treated. The investment stuff is serious. You don't play games with it. The labor stuff is like, oh, okay, you could talk about it. There's no real enforcement mechanism. No one's going to go to court and pay hundreds of millions of dollars in damage because they didn't comply with the terms of the labor conditions.
Same with the environment, right?
Exactly. There's nothing, and it's not that we couldn't put terms in. I mean, these are all intelligent people. If we wanted to put in terms with that agreement that had enforceable environmental standards, they would be there. And then if you had a situation where a company was breaking those standards, they would be paying very serious damages. That has not happened because of NAFTA.
Ross Perot, whom, as you both know, ran as a third-party candidate in 1992 against George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, warned us against NAFTA. Listen to this.
If you're paying $12, $13, $14 an hour for factory workers, and you can move your factory south of the border, pay $1 an hour for labor, hire a young 25, let's assume you've been in business for a long time, you've got a mature workforce. Pay $1 an hour for your labor, have no health care, that's the most expensive single element in making a car, have no environmental controls, no pollution controls, and no retirement, and you don't care about anything but making money, there will be a giant sucking sound going south.
He was prophetic.
Yeah. Well, and the funny bit about his math is that actually one of the things which is distressing, and apparently this is actually worse than the TPP, but the companies have tended to move production even when the economic case was very weak. And so when that happens, what you're really seeing is a transfer from labor. You're not really seeing shareholders benefit. You're basically seeing a transfer from factory labor to the top executives, that you're cutting their pay. I mean, there are industries like furniture. I mean, when you think about it, you've got U.S. wood and you're shipping it to China and then shipping it back. You know, a lot of the values in that wood, you lose a lot in the transit time. You also lose a lot in flexibility. And people in industries where you've got a lot of U.S. content in things that are shipped overseas and then sent back, and they've said the economic case just isn't very strong, but we did it because our stock would get a pop from.
During the 2008 campaign, candidate Obama was skeptical about NAFTA. Here's what he said then.
Scrap NAFTA, Senator Obama, or fix it.
I would immediately call the President of Mexico, the President of Canada, to try to amend NAFTA, because I think that we can get labor agreements in that agreement right now. And it should reflect the basic principle that our trade agreements should not just be good for Wall Street, it should also be good for Main Street. And the problem that we've had is that we've had corporate lobbyists oftentimes involved in negotiating these trade agreements, but the AFL-CIO hasn't been involved. Ordinary working people have not been involved. And we've got to make sure that our agreements are good for everybody, because globalization right now is creating winners and losers. But the problem is it's the same winners and the same losers each and every time.
What do you suppose is the influence on President Obama that caused him to reverse course on NAFTA and not fulfill what was a campaign pledge?
Well, I think it's the nature of politics in the United States. I mean, it's not a secret. You know, you have very powerful politically, economically people who, you know, are pushing for this. And, you know, we saw this with Wall Street, you know, when President Obama first came into office. You know, at that point, you know, Wall Street is on its back, meaning the financial industry. And basically, President Obama had it in his ability to break up the big banks, totally restructure finance. He decided not to go that route, and his top advisors, well, Robert Rubin clearly had an enormous role, was the top executive at Citigroup and formerly Goldman Sachs. He was not going to go that route because these were the people he was listening to, and I think that's continued to be the pattern throughout his administration, that he's listening to people, the corporate interest he was just talking about there. Those are the people who are steering the policy.
I mean, I'd go a little bit further than Dean on that, in that when you look at Obama's record of his campaign promises versus what he's actually done, there's sort of a normal, acceptable level of political lying, and Obama has gone way past what is historically been normal in terms of politicians fudging and then doing something else when they've been in office. This is just another example.
Do you buy Dean's argument that it is the power of Wall Street? And it is?
I think Obama's fundamentally a very conservative person. The idea that he ran as the anti-Bush because the country was desperate for somebody other than Bush, so he sold what would sell. He's liberal on social issues, but economically, he's not very different than the Republicans.
This discussion brings me to the economy. As you both know, the September jobs report, which was delayed by the government shutdown, was weak by all reports. What is it going to take to turn our economy around for working people and middle-class people out there who really are in pain?
Well, we clearly need much more rapid growth, and it's just not on the agenda. And it's sort of like, they seem to be hoping, when I'm saying they, people in Washington, including the Obama administration, somehow something's just going to jump out of nowhere, and the economy doesn't work that way. So, if we're going to see more rapid growth, it's fairly narrow places it has to come from. Are we going to see some surge in consumption? Very hard to see. Is there going to be a surge in investment? Very hard to see. Basically, the government's the one entity that has the ability to boost the economy.
By spending money.
By spending money. Larger deficits, that's what it boils down to. And that's, you cannot say that. I mean, I've talked to people in the administration, talked to people in Congress, they go, oh, I'll get killed if I say that. Well, someone's got to say it because that happens to be true.
Do you believe it?
Absolutely. I mean, if you want to look at the economy in a very simple way, we'll just get rid of the import-export sector because for the U.S. this won't change the story. You've got households, you've got the government, you've got businesses. Households tend to be net savers because people save for retirement and emergencies. Businesses, we like to think of as businesses being net borrowers because businesses invest and spend. And then therefore, the notion is, the reason that a lot of people are opposed to government running deficits is that they're afraid that the government will borrow and crowd out business investment. The fact is that businesses, even in the last expansion under Bush, were net saving, which is, so basically capitalists aren't acting like capitalists anymore. They've gotten so short-term oriented. And in a weak economy, they pull in their horns, they don't spend a lot, they don't invest then either. And now we've got companies literally borrowing hundreds of billions of dollars. They've got record levels of cash. What are they doing? They're buying back stock. So this is actually the time government should be running deficits, and yet it's anathema to say it politically.
Why is that? I mean, it seems to me the other side has won the argument.
Well, they've won it politically. What's striking is they've lost it completely in academic economics. This is an active area of economic research. At this point, there's been literally dozens of papers produced that show if we want to see growth in the economy today, the government's going to have to run larger deficits. So the opponents of big deficits say, no, that's going to undermine business confidence. So whatever the government does by way of increasing spending, we're going to undermine business confidence about consumer confidence, so that will offset it. People have studied this, and including the International Monetary Fund, which I mentioned here, because not so much as they're just authoritative, but they tend to be conservative. You'd expect them to typically be on the opposite side of this. They've produced a number of papers showing that no, the current context, bigger deficits will lead to more growth, more jobs. But politically, you can't say that. And I will disagree with Yves on this, because I do think trade actually could be part of this story, but here again, they can't talk about that. If you go to someone in the administration, to my view, if you want to see an improved trade balance, get the dollar down. Very simple. A lower value dollar means our goods are cheaper elsewhere in the world. Imports are more expensive to people in the United States, so we buy more domestically produced goods, fewer imports. Exchange rate policy is something they don't talk about. So the two things that could boost the economy, larger deficits, lower value dollar, are both things that they don't talk about.
You both keep saying they don't talk about this crucial issue. They don't talk about that crucial issue. They don't take the stand and speak the truth to us. What's going on?
I wrote something in 2010. I said that Obama believes that the response to any policy problem is better propaganda. And unfortunately, I think this is an illustration of that phenomenon.
But is it better propaganda to be silent when people can't get jobs, the job growth is down, we need to spend money and they're not doing it?
He won in 2012, even with a terrible economy. So it didn't, you know, it didn't seem to, running bad policies didn't seem to prevent him from getting reelected.
And the people in positions of power, they're basically doing okay. I mean, the stock market's up, corporate profits are at near record highs. So, you know, for the people who are in power, they're doing fine. So I'm not saying that they're all, you know, like evildoers who want people to suffer, but, you know, I've been, you know, I'm sure you could turn on the news any day of the week and you'll hear a round table like this. You won't be there, I won't be there, Iz won't be there. And they'll go, look, we just have to get through a tough time. And invariably, the people at the table aren't experiencing a tough time. So it's saying, you know, those tens of millions of people that are either unemployed or partially employed, haven't had a wage increase in years, they're going to have to get through tough times. So there's a real disconnect. The people who are sort of making policy, passing judgment on policy, they're okay. It's all these people around the country that are really suffering who don't really have a voice.
Yeah, I think it's even, and I think to amplify that, if you go to Washington, D.C., you know, it's incredibly prosperous. And most D.C. people, to the extent they leave D.C., they come to New York. And if you stay in the better heeled parts, if you stay in Manhattan, things look fine in Manhattan. Now, you have to not look out the window of the Acela. I mean, if you did, you'd see how bad things are. But, you know, it's very easy to ignore what's happening because, again, as Dean said, you know, these people all deal with other people who are basically doing fine, and they don't hear or have much contact with the people who are suffering.
Well, this brings us to the upcoming big fight over Social Security and Medicare. The top Republicans are saying repeatedly that they will be glad to end the sequester, the across-the-board federal cuts that took place earlier this year, if Democrats agree to future cuts in Social Security and Medicare. How do you both think this is going to play out?
Well, President Obama has indicated he's been willing to make cuts in both Social Security and Medicare, but I think he needs something more in taxes than the Republicans are prepared to give. So my guess is that you won't see that. But it does have me very concerned. These are openly on the table. And you look at the condition of today's elderly, I think you're really hard-pressed to say that they have too much money. I mean, for 40% of their people, 40% of people over age 65, their Social Security check is more than 90% of their income. And these are checks that average a little over $1,200 a month. So to say that these people are doing so well, we should be looking to cut back their benefits or have them pay more for Medicare, that to my mind seems 180 degrees wrong track.
No, I think to put it more bluntly, no one is willing to talk about the fact that Social Security and Medicare cuts equal having old people die faster. And that the proposals to do that are indirect, and they've labeled them in technical language so that most people won't realize that's what's happening. I mean, change CPI, you know, that's a my eyes glaze over term.
Consumer Price Index.
Right, and so that's the mechanism by which the Social Security is going to be cut, is that the cuts will basically lag the inflation that seniors experience.
And yet, I can just show you the headlines. President Obama said the other day the country has to address, quote, long-term obligations that we have around things like Medicare and Social Security. The chair of the Senate Budget Committee, Patty Murray, Democrat from Washington State, says all issues are on the negotiating table. The number 2 Democrat in the Senate, Dick Durbin, told Fox News on Sunday that Social Security is going to run out of money in 20 years. Medicare may run out of money in 10 years. Let's fix it now. That's Dick Durbin, number 2 man in the Senate. I mean, it sounds like Democrats are in a bargaining mood.
Absolutely. The one thing we have going for us is the vast majority of people across the country in both political parties are strongly opposed to these cuts. You know, so that is the thing they have to overcome. So you get 75–80% of Republicans, Tea Party Republicans, are opposed to cuts to these programs. But just to take the specific points that, you know, Senator Durbin raised, if you look at Social Security, it's gone from being about 4% of our economy in 2000 to about 5% today. It's projected to be about 6% in 20 years. That's because we have an aging population, the baby boomers. We could handle that. That's not a big deal. But when you talk about Medicare, it's a totally different story. That's being driven by our healthcare costs. We spend more than twice as much per person as the average for other wealthy countries. We have nothing to show for it in terms of outcomes. We have to fix our healthcare system. So talking about we're going to take this from seniors is totally wrong-headed. Now we can go back to our trade deal and say, okay, let's get lower-cost drugs, let's get lower-cost doctors. There are things we could do to fix healthcare. I've been on panels with a lot of these people. They go, oh, but Dean, fixing healthcare is hard. Well, thought you were the tough guys.
There's a piece of this that's even uglier, which is that the statistics that everyone relies on, you know, all the people that you quoted, come from the Congressional Budget Office. The more skeptical economists who've looked at them have actually found pretty serious problems with their forecasts. That even though they are, quote, nonpartisan in terms of not being affiliated with either party, they have in fact taken a very deficit hawkish approach to the way they put their numbers together. Two economists who are at the Federal Reserve, and they are probably the two most qualified economists in the country, they wrote a paper on the CBO's healthcare cost forecasts, and they shredded them. So if you were to use these Fed economists' forecasts, you wouldn't be anywhere near as concerned. You wouldn't have the drive to, quote, fix, end quote, these programs. But I think it's back to Dean's point that it's actually, for Medicare, it's a reflection of the way we do healthcare in this country. And the fact that we've got a where doctors are paid for services, and therefore they have an incentive to recommend more services. You've also got a population which is trained to think that more treatment is better. The desire to intervene quickly, even for things that aren't very serious, is very strong here.
Yeah, I'd agree with that completely. And just to make a couple points again, Social Security, I think it's just absurd to think of this as a problem. We're aging. I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, we could all have us die younger, but I don't think people would really think that's a good story. So that's going to cost money. And it does cost more money today than it did 20 or 30 years ago. It's going to cost more money in 20, 30 years from now. If people have normal wage growth, if people got their share of economic gains, we'd be talking about before-tax wages 30 years out that are 40 or 50% higher than they are today. You know, that's not an issue. Now, when it comes to health care, you know, he's exactly right, but the other thing, you know, I think we have to put this in some context. We don't know, and I think you're exactly right that the projections are likely too high. But let's say the Congressional Budget Office projections prove right. I don't think we're going to have morons running the country in 25 years. So if it really is the case that we're looking at these really big health care costs, they will be able to deal with that then.
On what basis do you make such a prediction?
Well, the reality, however much I might be critical of Congress and the President, we don't have a history of runaway deficits. As much as they like to say, oh, we actually don't, you know, and I'd argue they probably did too much. You know, you go back to the Clinton years, you know, they said, oh, we got to balance the budget, and of course they did. But the idea that we just had exploding deficits that, you know, Congress and the President just looked the other way, we don't have any history of that.
Eve, explain this then. It seems that although the facts and argument may be on your side, the politics of it is going in the other direction.
Well, there's a very effective messaging apparatus that doesn't include middle-class Americans. I think that's what it boils down to. You know, that the people that the reporters get their information from are the ones that significantly push stories. And a very significant percentage of the stories that appear for a very long period of time have always been driven basically by press releases or messaging. And Pew's studies have basically found the same thing's true now, that half the stories are literally promoted to the media. And then at the other half, inevitably, if you're a journalist, you're going to call some famous person who's legitimate, you know, to get the sort of plus and minus. And most of the famous people who are legitimate are, you know, either they're important government officials who are largely on board with the story, or they're going to be business interests. There are unfortunately only very small pockets of people who are considered to be legitimate that a journalist would call to get the other side of the story.
We started with free trade. Let's close with free trade. You're on the board of an organization called Just Foreign Policy, and that organization is offering a reward to anyone who can give it a copy of the negotiating text of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Any takers so far?
Not so far. So the idea here is that we do have people who are involved in the negotiating process. They have access to at least parts of the deal. So the hope is that someone from good conscience, presumably more than, you know, the hope of getting a big reward, will feel the urge to make it public. And, you know, the organization Just Foreign Policy, I'm on the board, but I don't play an active role in running it, will be happy to then post on the web so that, you know, people across the country, and really, you know, in all the countries, will have an opportunity to see it.
So in the last word here, both of you, the argument is this Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement will ensure a freer flow of goods and greater prosperity. The other side of it really serves essentially what we know about it, the corporate interest. Is that where you come down?
Very much so. I mean, this really is a deal that's being negotiated by corporations for corporations, and any benefit it provides to the bulk of the populations of this country will be purely incidental.
There'd be no reason to keep it so secret if it was in the interest of the public.
Eve Smith, Dean Baker, thank you very much for being with me.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.